Men walking away are bankrupting society. The most shocking truth emerging right now is that entire nations face natural extinction within a few generations because men have simply stopped participating in the old systems of relationships, marriage, and family building. South Korea's birth rate has plunged to levels never recorded in human history, hovering around zero point 0.7 children per woman, meaning each generation shrinks dramatically until the population effectively disappears without massive immigration or reversal. This collapse traces directly back to men walking away from the traditional roles society once demanded of them, choosing solitude, self focus, and minimal engagement over the burdens of provision and partnership that no longer offer fair returns. What starts as individual choices aggregates into societal bankruptcy, drained tax bases, crumbling welfare systems, and economies starved of the consumer spending and labor participation that once kept everything afloat. Stay with me through this entire discussion, because by the end, you will see irrefutable patterns across multiple countries proving the shift is not temporary frustration but a permanent structural change that demands we rethink everything about gender dynamics, economics, and the future of civilization itself. These men have hacked the system and are bankrupting women in society. Men walking away from society and relationships with women represents one of the most profound shifts occurring in modern times. And the consequences reach far beyond personal preferences into the core stability of nations. In the United States alone, estimates suggest tens of millions of working age men have effectively exited the traditional workforce and broader social structures, finding alternative paths to sustain themselves without relying on conventional employment or family obligations. These men turn to gig economy opportunities that offer flexibility without long term commitment. Invest in rental properties to generate passive income streams. Engage in day trading or cryptocurrency markets for potential high returns with limited daily effort. Build online businesses that run with minimal ongoing input or draw from accumulated savings and interest to cover basic needs. For those who qualify, government assistance programs provide additional support, including disability benefits, food assistance through SNAP, housing subsidies, Medicaid coverage, and charitable resources that collectively allow a low cost lifestyle without the grind of a standard 9 to 5 job. By remaining single and childless, these men drastically reduce their expenses, eliminating the high costs associated with dating, marriage, raising children, maintaining a family home, and supporting a partner's lifestyle expectations. Downsizing becomes a deliberate strategy, living far below our previous income levels in modest housing, eating simply, and prioritizing personal freedom over societal status markers. This lifestyle shift proves sustainable because without dependence or romantic entanglements, monthly outflows shrink to a fraction of what dual income households or traditional providers once managed. Women historically drive around 85% of all consumer purchases in many economies, yet a significant portion of that spending power originates from men's earnings through direct provision shared households or relationship based transfers. Men also shoulder approximately 80% of the total tax burden in places like the United States, funding the public systems that support social programs, infrastructure, and entitlements. When large numbers of men reduce their taxable income by working less, opting for cash based informal arrangements, or living off non taxable passive sources, government revenues decline sharply. Fewer men entering or staying in high earning careers means less income tax, payroll tax, and corporate contributions flowing into treasuries. Simultaneously, the refusal to engage in relationships with women cuts off the secondary economic activity that women once fueled through spending on clothing, dining, entertainment, travel, and household goods, often supported by male partners. The combined effect creates a vicious cycle of reduced economic velocity, lower GDP growth, strained public finances, and increasing pressure on remaining taxpayers, many of whom are already overburdened. This pattern extends well beyond the United States, appearing in varying degrees across developed and rapidly developing nations where similar dynamics of disillusionment and withdrawal take root. Feminism, in its various waves, promised liberation and equality, but in practice, it often reframed traditional male roles as inherently oppressive or toxic, leading to widespread cultural messaging that men were unnecessary, disposable, or even harmful. Campaigns emphasized independence, self sufficiency, and the rejection of patriarchal structures, which included discouraging women from valuing male provision, protection, or companionship. Men absorbed these messages over decades, internalizing that their contributions were unwelcome, unappreciated, or met with hostility. When women declared they could thrive without men, and society reinforced that narrative through media education and policy, many men responded by actually stepping back, accepting the premise, and building lives independent of female approval or involvement. This withdrawal brings a sense of peace for those men who discover that solitude offers stability, predictability, and personal control without the emotional volatility risks, financial drain, or legal vulnerabilities often associated with modern relationships. The outcome manifests as deliberate disengagement from dating, marriage, cohabitation, and even casual social interactions with women. In many cases, men simply cease initiating contact to avoid potential misinterpretation, conflict, or repercussions. In South Korea, this dynamic escalated into something particularly stark and measurable. What began as advocacy for women's rights and protections evolved into broader societal changes that men met with strategic compliance and countermeasures. When concerns arose about unwanted advances or harassment policies emerged, restricting interactions, including limits on how many times a man could express interest or invite a woman for casual outings before it crossed into legally risky territory. Men adopted strict adherence to these rules, interpreting them literally to protect themselves from accusations, leading to widespread avoidance of any initiating behavior. Simple conversations, friendships, or professional collaborations sometimes carry perceived risk, so many men minimize or eliminate contact altogether. This creates de facto separation, where women find themselves increasingly isolated from male attention partnership or even platonic engagement. Media content shifted as well, with romantic or flirtatious elements toned down or removed in response to earlier criticisms, now leaving entertainment feeling sterile to audiences who once enjoyed those dynamics. In workplaces, men intensified competition, focusing on hyper productivity mentoring within same gender networks and documenting interactions meticulously to safeguard against claims. This raised performance bars to levels difficult for many to sustain, contributing to higher female attrition, exhaustion, and health challenges reported in news coverage and policy discussions. The cumulative impact accelerates population decline as fewer relationships form, fewer children enter the world, and society edges closer to demographic tipping points. Japan presents a parallel trajectory, though expressed through quieter, more internalized withdrawal. Large portions of men opt out of romantic pursuits, prioritizing careers, hobbies, personal interests, and digital entertainment such as video games and anime. Social interactions with women diminish to functional necessities, leaving women to navigate a landscape where traditional courtship has largely vanished. Mockery or criticism directed at these men often backfires, reinforcing their resolve to remain detached and self contained. The result mirrors South Korea, with plummeting marriage rates, birth rates approaching critical lows, and long term population contraction that threatens economic sustainability, pension systems, and cultural continuity. In China, similar patterns emerge, with men increasingly avoiding marriage, domestic commitments, and even participation in organized dating activities. Events once drawing balanced crowds now see thousands of women attending with virtually no men present, as participants choose instead to conserve resources, focus on personal development, and explore opportunities abroad where cultural expectations align more closely with traditional femininity, appreciation, and mutual respect. And by the way, I'm now dropping classic angry guy rant videos exclusively for channel members, and you also get every upload early before it's released to the public. Hit the join button and become a member today. Now let's continue. Passport strategies gain popularity with men seeking partners in regions like Southeast Asia, where dynamics feel less adversarial and more reciprocal. Across these societies, the collapse of what some describe as the provision based or attention based economy becomes evident. Men reduce discretionary spending on women refusing to fund lifestyles, gift subscriptions, or indirect support without commensurate value returned. This shift disrupts ecosystems built around male generosity, including certain influencer models, content creation reliant on consistent male viewership, and broader consumer patterns tied to relationship signaling. Women who once relied on these channels face tightening circumstances as disposable income dries up and cost of living pressures mount without the buffer of shared resources. The state, positioned as an alternative provider, struggles under reduced revenues, unable to maintain expansive benefits for aging populations or support systems strained by demographic inversion. Military recruitment drops in some nations as fewer young men see purpose in institutional service, further weakening national security postures. These interconnected failures highlight how deeply integrated male participation once was in sustaining economic, social, and demographic health. The broader narrative reveals a cycle of action and reaction where initial pushes for change provoke countermeasures that amplify unintended consequences. Men who once accepted provider roles despite imbalances now calculate risks and rewards differently, finding greater satisfaction in autonomy than in entanglement. This recalibration proves resilient because it aligns with economic realities of high housing costs, stagnant wages, extended work demands, and legal frameworks that increase perceived hazards in interpersonal commitments. As withdrawal spreads, the fabric of society strains under the weight of absent contributions, leading to questions about long term viability. Nations confront shrinking workforces, aging populations, overburdened infrastructure, and cultural voids where family formation once anchored community life. The data from fertility rates, workforce participation, tax collections, and social trends paint a consistent picture of erosion driven by men's collective choice to prioritize self preservation over systemic perpetuation. This phenomenon demands examination not as isolated rebellion, but as rational adaptation to prevailing conditions. When incentives realign away from cooperation toward individual optimization, large scale disengagement follows logically. The peace many men report in the state stems from eliminated pressures, reduced financial exposure, emotional stability, and reclaimed time for pursuits that offer intrinsic rewards. Meanwhile, societies grapple with the fallout, including policy failures to reverse trends through subsidies, incentives, or campaigns that fail to address root causes. The conversation continues to unfold, revealing layer after layer of interconnection between gender expectations, economic structures, and demographic destinies. The patterns we observe today did not emerge overnight, but built gradually through decades of shifting incentives, cultural signals, and policy decisions that altered the fundamental calculus men used when deciding whether to invest in relationships, family, and broader societal participation. Early waves of feminism focused rightly on securing legal rights, voting access, education, and workplace opportunities that had long been denied. Yet, as gains accumulated, the messaging expanded into broader critiques that portrayed traditional masculinity not just as outdated, but as actively problematic. Media portrayals increasingly depicted men as bumbling incompetent or inherently predatory while highlighting female independence as the superior enlightened path. Educational systems incorporated these perspectives into curricula counseling young men that their natural inclinations toward provision, protection, and leadership required constant checking and often suppression. Workplace policies evolved to emphasize diversity initiatives that, in practice, sometimes penalized male advancement or created environments where men felt perpetually under scrutiny for ordinary behavior. Legal frameworks around family law, divorce proceedings, child custody, and domestic violence allegations tilted in ways that raised the stakes dramatically for men contemplating marriage or long term commitment. The combination of these elements created a risk reward profile that grew steadily worse over time, until for a growing cohort of men, the rational response became withdrawal rather than continued engagement. Consider the economic dimension more closely because money flows tell a story that official statistics sometimes obscure. When men reduce their labor force participation, they do not vanish from existence. They simply redirect energy toward lower visibility, lower taxed, or non taxed activities. A man who once earned a six-figure salary in a demanding corporate role might now manage a portfolio of short term rental properties, pulling in enough monthly cash flow to cover modest living expenses without ever punching a time clock again. Another might master options trading or cryptocurrency staking, generating returns that fluctuate but average sufficient to sustain independence. Still, others launch e commerce stores, print on demand businesses, or content platforms that require upfront effort but then run passively for years. These paths demand skill, discipline, and initial capital, yet they offer something traditional. Employment increasingly fails to provide autonomy, control over time, and insulation from corporate politics or gender based workplace dynamics. The aggregate effect across millions of such choices shrinks the pool of high earning taxable individuals, eroding the progressive tax base that governments rely upon to fund expansive social programs, entitlement systems, and public infrastructure. Revenue shortfalls force difficult choices: higher taxes on remaining workers, benefit cuts, delayed infrastructure repairs, or increased borrowing that pushes debt burdens onto future generations already facing demographic headwinds. Demographic mathematics compounds the problem with ruthless precision. Advanced economies depend on roughly 2.1 children per woman to maintain stable population levels without immigration. When fertility drops below replacement sustained over decades, the population pyramid inverts, producing fewer workers supporting larger cohorts of retirees. Japan reached this inflection point years ago with a fertility rate languishing around 1.3 and a rapidly aging society where elderly citizens outnumber children in many regions. Pension systems strain under the mismatch between contributors and beneficiaries. Healthcare costs spiral as age related conditions proliferate, and labor shortages force reliance on automation immigration or simply leaving positions unfilled. South Korea crossed an even lower threshold with fertility rates dipping below 1.0 and projections suggesting the population could halve within a single lifetime, absent major change. Schools consolidate or closed kindergartens stand. Empty military recruitment targets go unmet, and entire rural communities fade as young people concentrate in cities that themselves struggle to replace their aging residents. China confronts a similar trajectory, amplified by the legacy of one child policies that skewed gender ratios and conditioned generations to view large families as economically irrational. Guys, if you think you've missed the boat on Bitcoin, think again. The crypto world is exploding with new opportunities. And while Bitcoin has already made its millionaires, there's still a chance for you to get in early on the next big wave. I've put together an exclusive guide on 4 altcoins that could change the game and change your financial future. These aren't just hype coins. These are real projects with groundbreaking technology and massive upside potential. And here's the best part. When you subscribe, you'll get a free copy of my crypto blueprint. This is packed with valuable tips and strategies to help you get started, and it's yours just for joining. The link is in the description below. Let's make it happen. Across these nations, men opting out of marriage and parenthood accelerate the decline because each man who chooses bachelorhood removes potential children from future population counts and simultaneously reduces the economic multiplier effects that families generate through housing, education, healthcare, and consumer spending. The withdrawal extends beyond economics into the texture of everyday social life. Public spaces, once vibrant with mixed gender interaction, lose their former energy as men absent themselves from bars, restaurants, coffee shops, gyms, and social events. Many report feeling more relaxed in male only or solo environments where conversations flow without the undercurrent of potential misinterpretation or conflict. Digital spaces fill part of the void, offering communities centered on shared hobbies, gaming, investing, fitness, or intellectual pursuits that provide camaraderie without romantic expectations. This shift creates feedback loops where women notice the absence and respond sometimes with frustration, criticism, or attempts to shame men back into participation. Yet such reactions often reinforce the very detachment they seek to reverse. When mockery labels these men as losers, weak, or immature, it inadvertently validates their decision to disengage from environments that feel hostile. The result resembles a slow motion exodus, leaving behind a society that must adapt to functioning with significantly reduced male involvement in traditional relational and civic roles. Policy responses to these trends frequently miss the mark because they address symptoms rather than root incentives. Governments launch dating subsidies, offer baby bonuses, extend parental leave, or run public campaigns encouraging family formation. Yet participation remains low when the underlying risk calculation stays unfavorable. In some countries, attempts to rebalance family law or protect men from false allegations meet fierce resistance, framed as attacks on women's rights rather than efforts to restore mutual trust. Educational initiatives aimed at boys sometimes emphasize emotional vulnerability over traditional strengths, leaving many feeling alienated from both masculine identity and institutional support. The disconnect grows because solutions assume men will return to old patterns. Once carrots appear, ignoring that large numbers have already discovered viable alternatives that deliver greater personal satisfaction with far less exposure to downside risk. Passport strategies illustrate one such alternative gaining momentum among men who still desire companionship but reject domestic conditions. Travel to regions where cultural norms preserve appreciation for male provision, leadership, and protection, yields relationships that feel reciprocal rather than adversarial. Men report finding partners who value stability, family orientation, and traditional gender complementarity without the overlay of constant negotiation over power dynamics. These relationships often produce children in environments with lower cost of living, stronger community support, and less legal jeopardy, creating a brain drain of sorts as capable men redirect their reproductive and economic contributions elsewhere. Receiving countries benefit from influxes of skilled, motivated individuals, while sending countries lose both human capital and future taxpayers, further intensifying domestic demographic pressures. The collapse of male spending patterns disrupts additional sectors previously buoyed by relationship driven consumption. Luxury goods, fashion beauty services, high end dining travel experiences, and subscription based content targeted toward women often relied on indirect male funding through gifts, allowances, or shared budgets. When men stop participating in these flows, discretionary spending contracts, businesses adjust by raising prices, targeting narrower markets, or simply shrinking. Influencer economies built around male attention and generosity face similar contraction as viewers redirect resources toward personal goals rather than external validation. The so called simp economy, a term describing one sided financial transfers from men to women online or offline, loses its foundation when growing numbers conclude that such behavior yields diminishing or negative returns. Women accustomed to this support network encounter new realities where basic expenses become harder to cover without equivalent income streams or partner contributions. Military readiness provides another stark indicator of the broader withdrawal. Recruitment shortfalls plague several Western nations, with young men citing disillusionment, lack of purpose, perceived institutional bias, and better civilian opportunities as reasons for declining service. Volunteer forces shrink, forcing consideration of conscription policies that prove politically toxic in societies already divided over gender issues. National security suffers when fewer individuals stand willing to defend systems many perceive as having turned against their interests. This reluctance extends to other civic institutions, volunteerism, community leadership, and even voting participation in some demographics, creating governance challenges as engagement concentrates among narrower groups. These developments force uncomfortable questions about the long term sustainability of current social contracts. If men continue disengaging economies, contract populations shrink, welfare states falter, and cultural continuity weakens. Reversing the trend requires more than surface level incentives. It demands honest reckoning with the grievances that drove withdrawal in the first place. Restoring trust entails legal reforms that protect all parties, fairly cultural messaging that values male contributions without qualification, and economic structures that reward rather than punish family formation. Absent such changes, the momentum of detachment appears likely to persist, deepening the very crises it helps create. Yet within this landscape, some men report unprecedented levels of contentment. Freed from performance pressures, financial drain, emotional volatility, and legal exposure, they pursue education, travel, creative projects, physical fitness, and intellectual growth on their own terms. Days unfold according to personal rhythm rather than external demands. Relationships, if pursued, occur selectively with clear boundaries and mutual value. Solitude loses its former stigma, becoming instead a deliberate choice that delivers peace, clarity, and self mastery. This satisfaction proves durable because it rests on internal rather than relational validation, making it resistant to external appeals or shaming tactics. As more men experience this state, the cultural narrative slowly shifts, acknowledging that traditional paths no longer hold universal appeal, and that alternative lifestyles can sustain individual flourishing even as they challenge collective stability. The global scope of these shifts underscores their structural rather than merely cultural nature. Similar withdrawal patterns surface in varying degrees across North America, Western Europe, East Asia, and parts of Latin America, wherever modern feminism education, systems, legal frameworks, and economic pressures converge to raise the perceived costs of male participation in relationships and family life. Local variations exist. South Korea's explicit policy battles, Japan's quieter resignation, China's marriage strike, yet the core mechanism remains consistent. Men recalibrate priorities when old bargains appear broken and new options prove superior for personal well being. This convergence suggests the phenomenon transcends specific national contexts, emerging instead from universal tensions between individual optimization and collective reproduction requirements. Policymakers, economists, and social thinkers increasingly recognize the urgency, though consensus on remedies remains elusive. Some advocate returning to traditional incentives, subsidizing marriage, offering tax breaks for families, strengthening male economic prospects, or reforming family courts to reduce perceived bias. Others propose cultural campaigns celebrating fatherhood partnership and mutual respect, attempting to rebuild social trust eroded over decades. Still, others focus on technological adaptation, automation, immigration policy adjustments, and productivity enhancements to offset shrinking workforces. Each approach carries trade offs, and none yet demonstrates clear success in reversing fertility declines or male disengagement at scale. The conversation continues evolving as data accumulates and lived experiences multiply, revealing ever more layers of interconnection between gender dynamics, economic health, and demographic futures. The incentives that once pulled men toward marriage and family have eroded so thoroughly that replacement structures now dominate personal decision making for millions. Marriage once offered clear economic advantages for men through household specialization, shared resources, tax benefits, and social status, but modern realities invert many of those gains. Dual income households face higher combined tax brackets. Childcare expenses often consume one full salary, and divorce statistics show that asset division frequently leaves men with significantly reduced net worth, even when they were primary earners. Child support obligations can extend for decades, sometimes consuming 30 to 50% of after tax income, while custody arrangements grant fathers limited time with children, yet full financial responsibility. These outcomes stem from legal precedents and cultural norms that prioritize maternal custody and financial extraction from fathers, creating a system where men perceive marriage as a high stakes gamble with asymmetric downside risk. When the probability of dissolution hovers around 40 to 50% in many Western countries and the financial consequences fall disproportionately on one party, rational actors increasingly choose to avoid the contract altogether. Cohabitation without legal marriage offers some companionship benefits, but carries similar risks of common law claims in certain jurisdictions. So even that option loses appeal for cautious men. The result is a growing population of lifelong bachelors who structure their finances, time, and emotional energy around permanent independence. This independence manifests in concrete lifestyle choices that prioritize low overhead and high optionality. Many men relocate to lower cost regions within their countries or abroad, where housing consumes far less of their income, leaving more for personal pursuits. A modest apartment in a mid sized city or rural area paired with frugal habits, allows monthly expenses to drop below $2,000 in many cases, covering rent, utilities, basic groceries, internet streaming subscriptions, and occasional travel. Health maintenance shifts towards self directed routines, body weight training, home cooked meals, and preventive care rather than expensive gym memberships or frequent medical interventions. Social needs find fulfillment through male centric online communities, hobby groups, sports leagues, or occasional meetups that carry zero romantic expectation. Entertainment comes from affordable or free sources libraries, digital libraries, video platforms, gaming libraries, open source software, and secondhand markets for equipment. These adaptations demonstrate that baseline human needs require far fewer resources than consumer culture suggests, particularly when romantic and familial obligations disappear from the equation. The financial freedom that follows enables experimentation with side projects, skill acquisition, or early semi retirement forms of lifestyle that traditional family men rarely achieve until much later in life, if at all. Governments facing these behavioral shifts struggle to recapture lost revenue and participation. Progressive taxation systems built on the assumption of steadily rising male earnings and dual income households now confront flat or declining real wages for large segments of the workforce, combined with deliberate underemployment among men. Attempts to broaden the tax base through higher rates on remaining high earners trigger further exodus, either geographic through relocation to lower tax jurisdictions, or behavioral through reduced hours, freelance arrangements, or cash economies. Value added taxes, consumption taxes, and property taxes rise to compensate, yet these hit remaining families, harder widening inequality between single low expense men and traditional households. Entitlement programs designed for pay as you go financing face accelerating insolvency as worker to retiree ratios deteriorate. In the United States, Social Security projections show the trust fund depletion accelerating when fewer contributors replace retiring boomers, while Medicare costs explode with an aging population. Similar dynamics play out in Europe, where generous pension systems already strain under low fertility and now confront additional pressure from male workforce exit. Nations respond with incremental reforms, raising retirement ages, means testing benefits, or importing labor through immigration. But each measure creates political friction without addressing the core driver of native born male disengagement. Immigration emerges as a default solution, yet it carries its own complications. Younger migrants from higher fertility regions help balance demographics temporarily, but integration challenges cultural mismatches and political backlash limit long term effectiveness. Many receiving countries discover that imported workers often adopt local low fertility patterns within 1 or 2 generations, particularly when exposed to the same economic pressures, legal risks, and cultural messaging that drove native withdrawal. Meanwhile, source countries lose their most capable young men, creating brain drain that hampers their own development. The global churn produces short term demographic patches at the cost of long term cultural cohesion and economic stability in both sending and receiving societies. Some nations experiment with selective migration policies favoring skilled workers or those likely to form families, yet these approaches still fail to reverse the underlying native born trend of men opting out of reproduction and high tax participation. Cultural feedback loops reinforce the detachment in ways that prove difficult to interrupt. Media continues to portray traditional masculinity as toxic or obsolete, while simultaneously lamenting the lack of marriageable men, a contradiction that many men interpret as further evidence of bad faith. Dating app algorithms amplify hypergamous preferences, presenting women with endless high status options, while ordinary men receive minimal matches, leading to rapid disillusionment and account deletion. Social media amplifies female success stories, independence narratives, and luxury lifestyles, often funded indirectly by male attention or provision, yet rarely acknowledges the male contributions that enabled those displays. When men point out the imbalance, they encounter dismissal, minimization, or accusations of entitlement, which only accelerates their retreat into spaces where such criticism cannot reach. Male only forums, podcasts, and video channels proliferate, offering validation, community, and practical advice for thriving outside traditional expectations. These ecosystems grow because they address real grievances with direct language and actionable strategies rather than platitudes about compromise or personal growth within broken systems. The psychological dimension deserves attention because sustained withdrawal changes how men view themselves in the world. Many report reduced anxiety, improved focus, sharper decision making, and a sense of reclaimed agency once they exit the cycle of seeking female approval, validation, or partnership. Depression rates among single men sometimes appear lower than among married men in certain studies when controlling for other variables, suggesting that the stress of modern relationships outweighs the benefits of companionship for a sizable group. Self esteem shifts from external markers, children status, partner, attractiveness, to internal metrics, skill mastery, financial control, physical capability, and personal integrity. This reorientation proves stabilizing because it rests on factors within direct control rather than unpredictable interpersonal dynamics. Men describe the shift as waking from a long obligation induced fog, discovering that life without constant performance pressure allows genuine enjoyment of simple activities, reading, walking, nature, observation, creative work, or unstructured leisure. The absence of drama, conflict, negotiation, and emotional labor creates mental bandwidth that redirects toward long term projects or pure recreation. Economic sectors tied to family formation suffer measurable contraction. Housing markets in many countries rely heavily on demand from young couples seeking starter homes, yet shrinking marriage rates reduce that buyer pool, pushing prices sideways or downward in some regions, while luxury single occupancy units gain popularity. Education industries face declining enrollment as fewer children enter school systems, leading to teacher layoffs, campus consolidations, and program cuts. Baby product manufacturers, toy companies, pediatric services, and family oriented entertainment all experience softening demand that correlates tightly with fertility collapse. Retail sectors dependent on female discretionary spending contract when male funding streams dry up, forcing adaptation towards self purchase models, higher price points, or digital delivery. Automotive manufacturers notice shifts towards smaller, more fuel efficient vehicles as single men prioritize economy over family hauling capacity. The cumulative impact ripples through supply chains, employment, and investment returns, creating headwinds for entire industries once considered recession proof. National defense postures weaken in tandem with recruitment shortfalls. Western militaries report persistent difficulty meeting enlistment quotas, particularly among young men who cite distrust of institutions, lack of clear mission, perceived anti male bias, and superior civilian opportunities. Training pipelines, slow equipment maintenance suffers from personnel shortages, and readiness levels drop in ways that adversaries notice. Some branches lower standards or offer larger bonuses, yet these measures treat symptoms rather than the underlying motivation collapse. Reserve components face similar challenges as civilian men increasingly view military affiliation as incompatible with personal autonomy and risk management priorities. The result is a gradual hollowing of conventional forces at precisely the moment geopolitical tensions rise, forcing greater reliance on technology deterrence alliances or simply reduced global projection capability. International relations reflect these internal weaknesses. Nations with severe demographic decline lose soft power as their populations shrink, cultures age, and economic weight diminishes relative to younger rising powers. Diplomatic influence wanes when domestic priorities center on managing pension crises, healthcare overload, and labor shortages rather than global leadership. Alliances strain when member states cannot meet defense commitments or contribute meaningfully to collective security. Migration pressures intensify as poorer, high fertility regions seek entry into wealthier, low fertility ones, creating border challenges, political polarization, and resource competition. The global order built on post war assumptions of stable, growing Western populations begins to fracture under the weight of uneven demographic trajectories. Men who pursue overseas relationships often settle permanently in receiving countries contributing their productivity taxes and children to foreign societies rather than their birth nations. This transfer accelerates the relative decline of origin countries while strengthening destinations that maintain more balanced gender incentives. Over time, entire regions risk becoming demographic museums, preserving languages, traditions, and architecture for shrinking elderly populations supported by imported labor and remittances. The irony is sharp societies that championed individual choice and female empowerment now confront the aggregate consequence of millions of individual men exercising their own choice to walk away permanently. These developments challenge foundational assumptions about progress. The belief that decoupling reproduction from economic necessity through technology welfare states and gender equality would liberate humanity from biological constraints instead reveals new vulnerabilities. When voluntary childlessness becomes the majority preference among men and significant numbers of women, the social technology designed to replace family support proves inadequate against actuarial reality. Welfare states require expanding worker bases to fund retirees, yet they simultaneously discourage the family formation necessary to produce those workers. Gender equality policies that raise female opportunity costs for childbearing without equivalent reductions in male relationship risks produce net fertility collapse. The contradiction embeds deeply within modern liberalism itself, promising freedom while engineering conditions that shrink the population base required to sustain that freedom. Recognition of this paradox grows among academics, economists, demographers, and even some policymakers, though public discourse remains constrained by political sensitivities. Papers analyzing male withdrawal receive citations in specialized journals, yet mainstream outlets frame the issue primarily as female hardship or toxic masculinity rather than systemic incentive failure. Think tanks propose pronatalist packages, yet pilot programs show limited uptake when underlying distrust persists. Cultural figures occasionally call for course correction, yet face backlash that discourages broader conversation. The silence itself becomes diagnostic signaling that the topic touches third rail questions about gender power economics and the viability of current social arrangements. Despite institutional inertia, the behavioral shift among men continues gaining momentum through network effects, word of mouth, digital communities, and visible success stories. Each man who thrives in solitude or oversees relationships serves as living proof that alternatives work, reducing the perceived necessity of traditional paths. Younger cohorts inherit this knowledge earlier, avoiding the trial and error costs borne by older generations. Dating market participation drops further as remaining single men observe the advantages of non participation and adjust expectations downward. The flywheel turns steadily accelerating detachment until reversal requires fundamental redesign of incentives, laws, culture, and economic structures, an undertaking few societies appear prepared to undertake at scale. The scale of this transformation becomes clearer when examining how men have systematically rebuilt their value hierarchies in response to perceived betrayal by institutions once considered neutral or supportive. Family courts in particular, have become emblematic of systemic imbalance, where financial awards, child support, alimony asset splits, and custody decisions routinely favor one party, creating precedents that younger men study and internalize long before they ever consider commitment. High profile cases broadcast through digital channels showcase men losing homes, retirement accounts, future earnings, and access to children over allegations that sometimes prove unsubstantiated yet carry irreversible consequences. The knowledge spreads virally through forums, comment sections, podcasts, and private messages until avoidance becomes default strategy rather than reaction to personal experience. Men in their late teens and early 20s now enter adulthood already armed with detailed risk assessments shared by older siblings, cousins, friends, online mentors, and anonymous strangers who document their journeys through separation, divorce, bankruptcy, and supervised visitation. This collective learning curve compresses decades of hard won wisdom into instant accessible form, making the decision to remain single feel less like rebellion and more like basic self preservation. Financial independence movements among men accelerate this detachment by providing concrete blueprints for escaping the traditional earn, spend, provide cycle. Concepts once fringe, such as lean fire, financial independence, retire early variants tailored to minimalism, gain mainstream traction within male communities. Practitioners track every dollar cut expenses to bare essentials, invest aggressively in index funds, dividend stocks, real estate crowdfunding, or peer to peer lending, and aim for portfolio sizes that generate 4% safe withdrawal rates, covering modest lifestyles indefinitely. A 25-year-old software developer earning $120,000 annually might live on $30,000 per year, sock away the difference aggressively, and project freedom from mandatory employment by age 38, even accounting for inflation, healthcare, and occasional splurges. These calculations exclude children, spouses, or extended family obligations, removing massive variables that traditionally derail such plans. When thousands adopt similar mathematics simultaneously, aggregate savings rates, climb investment capital concentrates in fewer hands, and consumption patterns shift away from status goods toward experiences, assets, or digital goods that require little ongoing maintenance. Corporate environments contribute to the exodus by evolving into spaces where men increasingly feel like outsiders in their own professions. Diversity, equity, inclusion frameworks sometimes translate into hiring, promotion, mentoring, and resource allocation priorities that sideline male employees or subject them to mandatory training sessions emphasizing unconscious bias, privilege, toxicity, and the need for constant self correction. Performance reviews incorporate soft metrics, emotional intelligence, team collaboration, inclusivity statements that many men experience as subjective traps rather than objective evaluations. Networking events, social gatherings, and informal mentorship often segregate along gender lines, with women focused groups receiving institutional support while equivalent male spaces face scrutiny or outright prohibition. The cumulative atmosphere breeds cynicism. Men clock and handle core responsibilities, avoid extracurricular visibility, minimize exposure to potential complaints, and direct energy toward side hustles, remote freelance work, or skill building outside company walls. Loyalty erodes when advancement feels contingent on ideological conformity rather than Raw output leading capable individuals to disengage quietly, reducing overtime innovation, discretionary effort, and long term career investment. Education pipelines feed directly into this disaffection by producing generations of young men who encounter systemic disadvantages early. Boys lag girls in high school graduation rates, college enrollment, and degree completion across most developed nations, with gaps widening over time. Curricula emphasize collaborative, project based learning, verbal expression, emotional literacy, and consensus building traits that align more closely with female socialization patterns while undervaluing competition, solitary focus, spatial reasoning, or abstract systems thinking often stronger in male cohorts. Discipline policies, zero tolerance frameworks, counseling interventions, and medication rates target boys disproportionately, creating records that follow them into higher education and employment. University campuses amplify these dynamics through Title IX expansions, speech codes, bias response teams, and grievance procedures that many men perceive as guilty until proven innocent mechanisms. Enrollment declines among men accelerate particularly in humanities, social sciences, and education fields, leaving STEM as one of the few remaining male strongholds. Yet, even there, diversity initiatives push for rebalancing that sometimes feels punitive to existing students. Graduates emerge into job markets already primed with skepticism toward institutions that appear to have stacked decks against them from kindergarten onward. Health outcomes reflect the toll of prolonged stress followed by deliberate withdrawal. Men who remain entangled in adversarial relationships or high pressure provider roles show elevated cortisol, cardiovascular strain, sleep disruption, substance use, and shortened lifespans compared with peers who exit early. Once detached, many reverse these markers through consistent sleep resistance training, nutrition, optimization, sunlight exposure, nature, immersion, and stress elimination. Testosterone levels stabilize or rise in low conflict environments free from chronic relational tension, performance anxiety, or financial servitude. Mental clarity sharpens as cognitive load drops, allowing deeper focus on complex problems, creative output, or strategic planning. Longevity advantages begin to appear in longitudinal data comparing never married childless men against their married counterparts when controlling for baseline health and socio and economic status, suggesting that the protective effect of a marriage, once touted universally, may apply selectively or conditionally in modern contexts. Technological enablers supercharge the viability of solitary lifestyles, turning what once required rare discipline into scalable norm. High-speed internet delivers infinite entertainment, education connection, and income opportunity without leaving home. Streaming platforms, gaming ecosystems, virtual reality, social spaces, and AI companions fill interaction gaps for those who choose minimal human contact. Telemedicine, mail order pharmacies, grocery delivery drone services, and autonomous vehicles reduce necessity for public exposure. Cryptocurrency, decentralized finance, peer to peer marketplaces, and blockchain based identity systems offer pathways around traditional banking, credit, surveillance, and taxation choke points. Open source software, free learning resources, coding boot camps, and remote work platforms democratize skill acquisition, allowing men in any location to compete globally without corporate gatekeepers. These tools collectively lower the floor for sustainable independence making, withdrawal feasible for middle class and working class men alike, rather than just those with inherited wealth or elite credentials. Global fertility maps now display stark regional divergences that trace directly to varying intensities of male disengagement. Nordic countries, despite generous family policies, gender equality rankings, and high female workforce participation, record some of the steepest birth rate drops as men mirror patterns seen elsewhere. Southern and Eastern European nations already facing population contraction see accelerated decline when young men emulate East Asian withdrawal models through digital communities. Latin American countries, historically higher fertility zones, show emerging cracks as urban middle class men adopt passport strategies, online red pill content, and anti feminist rhetoric imported via social media. Sub Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia maintain higher rates, yet rapid urbanization, education expansion, and exposure to Western cultural exports begin seeding similar skepticism among younger cohorts. The worldwide trend points toward convergence on sub replacement fertility, with cultural, religious, and economic exceptions becoming outliers rather than norms. Urban planning and real estate markets adapt unevenly to shrinking household sizes and falling formation rates. Developers pivot toward micro apartments, co living spaces, single occupancy luxury rentals, and senior focused communities, while family sized homes linger on markets longer or convert to multi generational or investment properties. Cities lose vibrancy in districts once defined by young couples, playground schools, and retail catering to children. Commercial real estate suffers as family oriented businesses, restaurants, kid friendly venues, toy stores, daycare centers, and pediatric clinics consolidate or shutter. Public transportation ridership patterns shift toward individual commutes rather than family outings. Parks, playgrounds, and recreational facilities face underutilization or repurposing, while demand grows for adult only fitness trails, meditation spaces, esports arenas, and quiet workspaces. Municipal budgets strain under falling school tax revenues, coupled with rising costs for elder services, infrastructure maintenance, and social care programs for isolated seniors. Energy systems face parallel pressures from demographic inversion. Fewer workers mean slower grid modernization, reduced maintenance crews, delayed renewable transitions, and vulnerability to supply disruptions. Industrial output contracts when labor shortages hit manufacturing, logistics, and construction simultaneously. Innovation slows as risk averse older populations prioritize stability over breakthrough research, while younger cohorts shrink in absolute numbers. Patent filings, scientific publications, and startup formation rates begin correlating negatively with fertility collapse in longitudinal studies across OECD nations. The virtuous cycle of population growth, fueling technological progress, economic expansion, and living standard improvements reverses into a downward spiral where each generation inherits thinner resources, thinner talent pools, and heavier burdens. Cultural production reflects these shifts in both content and consumption. Storytelling pivots towards solitary protagonists, anti hero narratives, dystopian isolation themes, and celebration of chosen families over biological ones as creators themselves. Age and childlessness becomes personal reality for many in entertainment industries. Music genres emphasizing independence, self reliance, melancholy, introspection, and rejection of traditional romance gain streaming dominance among male listeners. Video games evolve into primary social outlets offering progression systems, mastery feedback loops, community without vulnerability, and escapism without real world stakes. Literature, philosophy, and online discourse explore voluntary celibacy, anti fragility, digital nomadism, stoicism, minimalism, and post familial identity as legitimate paths rather than pathologies. The cultural center of gravity drifts away from reproduction continuity legacy and intergenerational obligation toward present moment optimization, individual authenticity, and sovereign selfhood. Men who pioneered this path now serve as informal elders within digital tribes, transmitting knowledge across generations. They document net worth journeys, minimalist setups, daily routines, relationship postmortems, legal navigation strategies, geographic arbitrage tactics, and psychological frameworks for long term contentment. Newer adherents skip years of trial and error by studying these archives, absorbing principles of frame control, boundary enforcement outcome, independence, abundance mentality, and value based decision making. The transmission occurs horizontally, peer to peer, rather than vertically parent to child, inverting traditional wisdom transfer patterns. Grandfathers once taught grandsons how to court, marry, provide, and lead, now find themselves outnumbered by anonymous online voices, teaching those same grandsons how to disappear, thrive alone, and never look back. This inversion creates profound civilizational questions that institutions avoid confronting directly. If biological replacement falls below critical thresholds and voluntary withdrawal becomes self reinforcing, how do societies reproduce themselves culturally, economically, demographically, and politically? When the modal life path shifts from family provider to solitary optimizer, what replaces the social glue once supplied by kinship networks, reciprocal obligations, and shared stakes in future generations? Can artificial intelligence automation, universal basic income mass immigration, or pronatalist technology reverse the trajectory without addressing the incentive failures that triggered detachment in the first place? The absence of compelling answers leaves societies drifting toward default outcomes, shrinking populations, aging profiles, thinner economies, fragile institutions, and cultural amnesia regarding the conditions that once sustained large scale human flourishing. The quiet revolution unfolding among men reveals itself most starkly in the realm of time allocation, once the most scarce and contested resource in traditional male life paths. Provider roles historically demanded 80-hour work weeks overtime, sacrifices, weekend commitments, career relocations, and constant availability to climb ladders that promise security for dependents. Men traded decades of prime vitality for promised stability, only to discover that stability proved illusory when economic shocks, corporate downsizing, automation, divorce proceedings, or health crises arrived unannounced. The men who walk away reclaim those hours with surgical precision, redirecting them toward pursuits that compound personal capital rather than dissipate it in service to systems that extract without reciprocal loyalty. A typical day might begin with sunrise strength training, followed by deep work blocks on personal projects, skill acquisition, language learning, instrument practice, or open source contributions. Afternoons could involve market analysis, property scouting, content creation, or simply unstructured reflection in natural settings. Evenings often center on low stimulation recovery, reading philosophy, history, biography, or watching documentaries that feed intellectual curiosity without emotional overhead. Sleep extends to 8 or 9 hours because no crying infant, no relational conflict, and no looming financial deadline disrupt circadian rhythm. The result is physiological regeneration, mental acuity, and a growing sense of mastery over existence that traditional lifestyles rarely permit. This reclaimed sovereignty extends to geographic freedom as men exploit remote work possibilities, digital nomad visas, and cost of living arbitrage to escape high tax, high regulation, high cost urban centers that once trapped them in provider cycles. Destinations range from affordable Southeast Asian cities with modern infrastructure, low crime rates, and welcoming social climates to Eastern European capitals, offering cultural depth, historical richness, and far lower monthly burn rates than Western counterparts. Some choose Latin American beach towns, where fresh food, outdoor activity, and relaxed pace replace the grind of commuter rail, corporate politics, and inflated real estate prices. Others settle in rural pockets within their home countries, converting barns into minimalist living spaces or purchasing small plots for off grid experiments that further reduce dependency on centralized utilities, employment, and consumer supply chains. Mobility itself becomes a form of wealth because each relocation resets the cost baseline downward while exposing men to new perspectives, cuisines, social norms, and potential partnerships unburdened by domestic cultural baggage. The passport no longer serves merely as travel document, but as strategic asset enabling rapid exit when local conditions deteriorate further or when better opportunities emerge elsewhere. Relationships that do form under these new conditions carry markedly different character from those of previous generations. When men re enter the romantic marketplace, they do so from abundance rather than scarcity, with clear non negotiables forged through years of observation and self sufficiency. Compatibility now hinges on mutual respect, emotional stability, shared values around family gender roles, and finances rather than superficial markers or societal pressure. Many prioritize partners from cultural backgrounds where traditional femininity remains valued. Provision is appreciated without entitlement, and legal systems maintain greater balance in family matters. These unions frequently produce children because the risk calculus shifts favorably when both parties enter with realistic expectations, transparent communication, and prenuptial safeguards. Children raised in such environments benefit from fathers who remain present, engaged, and financially secure, rather than exhausted, resentful, or legally marginalized. The contrast with domestic patterns highlights how deeply incentive structures shape outcomes when men face lower perceived hazards, they invest more readily and more generously. Societies that lose these selective reproducers face accelerating hollowing of their most productive cohorts. The men who depart physically or psychologically take with them not only future children, but also the innovation, problem solving, risk taking, and long hours endurance that historically drove technological, economic, and infrastructural progress. Remaining populations skewed toward risk averse conformity, shorter time horizons, and consumption over creation. Universities report declining male applications in engineering, physics, computer science, mathematics, and other high difficulty fields that require sustained solitary focus and tolerance for failure. Those who persist often choose entrepreneurial paths, startups, consulting, independent research, or international opportunities rather than corporate or public sector ladders that demand ideological alignment and offer diminishing returns. The brain drain compounds when these capable individuals relocate permanently, contributing patents, startups' GDP growth, and tax revenue to host nations instead of origin countries already struggling with native disengagement. Financial ecosystems adapt to the new reality in ways that further entrench detachment. Banking products shift toward high yield savings, crypto friendly platforms, robo advisors with minimal fees, and privacy focused services as men seek insulation from inflationary policies, capital controls, and institutional surveillance. Peer to peer lending, decentralized, autonomous organizations, blockchain identity verification, and self custodied assets gain adoption among those who view traditional finance as increasingly extractive or unreliable. Barter networks, local crypto economies, and skilled trading communities emerge in parallel, offering alternatives to fiat dependent consumption. These parallel systems reduce reliance on state controlled money velocity and taxation mechanisms, creating pockets of economic sovereignty that prove resilient during currency devaluation, banking crises, or policy overreach. The aggregate effect shrinks the velocity of money within mainstream economies, further pressuring central banks, governments, and legacy institutions already contending with declining participation. Social trust erodes in tandem with male withdrawal because reciprocal obligations, once enforced through kinship marriage community expectation and reputational pressure, lose their binding power. Neighborhoods once knit together by school events, youth sports block parties, and extended family gatherings grow quieter as childless households predominate and remaining families retreat inward. Volunteer organizations, service clubs, fraternal orders, and civic associations report aging memberships, shrinking rosters, and leadership vacuums when younger men decline participation, viewing such groups as outdated obligations rather than meaningful outlets. Philanthropy patterns change as men direct giving toward causes aligned with personal values rather than broad societal institutions, often favoring animal welfare, environmental preservation, individual scholarships, or direct aid to specific people over large bureaucratic charities. The shift reflects a broader reorientation from collective duty toward selective generosity, where trust must be earned rather than assumed. Media consumption habits diverge sharply between genders and age cohorts, creating parallel cultural realities that rarely intersect. Men gravitate toward long form podcasts, technical deep dives, historical analysis, geopolitical strategy, financial education philosophy discussions, and unfiltered commentary that bypasses mainstream gatekeepers. Women continue consuming lifestyle content, relationship advice, celebrity culture, social issue documentaries, and narrative driven entertainment, often framed through emotional or moral lenses. The divergence produces echo chambers where each side receives constant reinforcement of its priors with minimal exposure to opposing viewpoints. Attempts at cross pollination through joint media or public discourse frequently devolve into hostility because foundational assumptions about fairness, risk responsibility, and value exchange have grown so far apart. The result resembles two civilizations occupying the same geographic space, yet inhabiting entirely different informational and moral universes. Law enforcement and judicial systems feel secondary effects as caseloads shift and public legitimacy wanes. Domestic violence allegations, family court filings, child support enforcement actions, and restraining order requests remain high, yet cooperation from male populations declines when perceived legitimacy falls. Jury nullification becomes more frequent in cases involving perceived institutional overreach, while witness participation drops in nonviolent matters. Police recruitment mirrors military patterns, with young men citing danger, lack of support, public vilification, and better private sector alternatives as reasons for declining applications. Correctional facilities face staffing shortages, leading to reduced programming, early releases, and increased recidivism risk. The cumulative strain weakens rule of law perceptions, further eroding voluntary compliance and increasing reliance on surveillance technology, automated enforcement, and punitive measures that alienate rather than integrate. Religious institutions confront parallel membership collapse as men view organized faith as another domain demanding unreciprocated sacrifice without commensurate spiritual or communal return. Traditional denominations report plummeting attendance among working age males, while non denominational independent spiritual communities, online philosophy groups, or secular ethical frameworks gain adherents by offering meaning without institutional overhead guilt based obligation or gender role prescriptions that feel outdated or punitive. Some men rediscover faith in personal contemplative forms, meditation, stoic practice, nature-based spirituality, or ancestral traditions stripped of modern political overlays. The shift weakens the social capital role once played by churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples as hubs for family formation, community service, moral instruction, and intergenerational continuity. Public health systems buckle under demographic inversion as chronic disease burdens concentrate among aging populations while preventive care participation drops among younger, disengaged cohorts. Vaccination rates, screening adherence, intervention uptake, and mental health service utilization show widening gender and age gaps. Telehealth platforms gain dominance among men who prefer privacy, efficiency, and minimal institutional interaction, yet overall system capacity shrinks when fewer medical professionals enter training pipelines. Pharmaceutical innovation slows as research funding diverts toward elder care treatments rather than breakthrough therapies for working age populations. The mismatch between healthcare demand and supply capacity creates rationing, waiting lists, deferred procedures, and declining outcomes that further depress public confidence in state managed systems. These converging pressures force governments into ever more desperate fiscal maneuvers. Debt issuance accelerates to cover entitlement shortfalls, infrastructure backlogs, and emergency stimulus measures. Interest payments consume larger budget shares, crowding out discretionary spending, education, defense research, and social investment. Currency debasement, inflation targeting, and negative real yields become normalized tools for eroding debt burdens, yet they punish savers, retirees, and fixed income populations while rewarding debtors, speculators, and asset holders. Capital flight intensifies as mobile, high skill individuals relocate to jurisdictions offering greater stability, lower extraction, and clearer rule sets. The resulting revenue holes trigger austerity cycles, higher consumption taxes, wealth levies, exit taxes, and regulatory tightening that accelerate the very exodus they aim to prevent. Men observing these dynamics from the sidelines treat them as confirmation of earlier decisions to minimize exposure. They maintain small cash reserves, precious metals, foreign accounts, offshore trusts, and portable skill sets that allow rapid adaptation to changing conditions. Preparedness replaces blind faith in institutional continuity, turning self reliance from fringe philosophy into practical necessity. The mindset spreads through digital networks, creating a distributed, resilient subculture capable of thriving amid systemic decay rather than depending on its repair. Philosophically, the movement challenges core Enlightenment premises about progress, universalism, and collective improvement. When individual optimization consistently outperforms collective participation, the social contract phrase because rational actors defect from arrangements that impose net costs. Game theory models once used to explain cooperation in repeated interactions now illustrate defection cascades when trust collapses and punishment mechanisms weaken. Evolutionary biology perspectives highlight how reproductive strategies shift under novel environmental pressures favoring quantity minimization, quality maximization, or complete withdrawal when offspring survival costs exceed benefits. Existentialist thought finds new relevance as men confront absurdity, meaninglessness, and freedom in societies that demand participation without offering transcendent purpose or reciprocal value. The long arc suggests a future where shrinking civilizations preserve pockets of high functioning order amid broader contraction. Some nations may stabilize through aggressive cultural, religious, or policy interventions that restore balanced incentives, protect male interests, and celebrate family formation. Others drift toward managed decline, importing labor, subsidizing reproduction, automating production, and redefining national identity around heritage rather than demographics. A few experiment with radical decentralization charter cities, special economic zones, or blockchain governed communities that compete for talented, mobile individuals by offering superior governance, clarity, and freedom. The outcome remains contingent, yet the direction appears set unless fundamental course corrections occur swiftly and decisively. The trajectory now points toward a bifurcated global order where some societies manage partial stabilization through deliberate cultural countermovements, while others slide irreversibly toward contraction and managed decline. Nations that recognize the incentive misalignment early enough can still attempt course correction by implementing sweeping reforms that restore perceived fairness in family law, reduce punitive financial outcomes for men in divorce proceedings, equalize custody presumptions, eliminate no fault mechanisms that enable unilateral dissolution without consequence, and introduce robust protections against false allegations through mandatory evidence standards, swift sanctions for proven perjury, and automatic cost shifting to unsuccessful complainants. Tax codes could shift toward pronatalist neutrality by eliminating marriage penalties, expanding child tax credits into refundable forms that benefit single earner households, and offering meaningful deductions for education, healthcare, and housing tied directly to family formation rather than consumption. Workplace policies might evolve to reward raw productivity over performative inclusivity metrics while creating protected male mentorship networks parallel to existing female ones, ensuring equal access to sponsorship guidance and advancement pathways. Educational reforms could rebalance curricula toward competitive, rigorous content that engages male learning styles while maintaining equity without lowering standards or pathologizing natural behavioral differences. Cultural messaging campaigns funded by private foundations rather than governments could celebrate fatherhood as heroic masculine contribution rather than optional accessory framing, provision leadership, and protection as virtues worthy of respect instead of relics of oppression. Religious communities that adapt by emphasizing mutual obligation, reciprocity, and spiritual purpose over guilt based duty or gender neutral platitudes often retain higher retention rates among men, providing moral frameworks that anchor family commitment in transcendent rather than transactional terms. Where such reforms occur, fertility stabilizes or modestly rebounds within a decade as trust slowly rebuilds and men recalculate the risk reward equation in favor of participation. Countries like Hungary, Poland, Israel, and certain Gulf states already demonstrate elements of this approach, combining financial incentives, cultural reinforcement, legal balance, and sometimes explicit pronatalist rhetoric to maintain birth rates noticeably above regional averages. The common thread lies in treating male disengagement as rational response rather than moral failing, addressing root grievances directly instead of shaming participants back into old roles. Success remains partial because decades of cultural momentum cannot reverse overnight, yet the evidence suggests that deliberate realignment of incentives, legal protections, and social valuation can halt decline and, in some cases, produce gradual recovery. In contrast, nations that double down on existing frameworks, framing withdrawal as entitlement toxicity or backlash against progress, accelerate the very outcomes they seek to prevent. When policy responses consist primarily of increased subsidies for single mothers, expanded welfare for child rearing women, mandatory diversity quotas, harsher enforcement of support obligations, or public campaigns that portray traditional masculinity as problematic, the aggregate message to men remains clear. Continued participation carries disproportionate risk with diminishing reward. Under these conditions, withdrawal intensifies, digital communities grow more insular, passport strategies scale rapidly, and native born reproduction drops toward East Asian extremes. Pension crises deepen, military recruitment collapses, infrastructure, maintenance lags, Innovation funding diverts toward palliative elder care rather than frontier research, and political discourse polarizes between aging majorities clinging to entitlement promises and shrinking younger cohorts refusing to fund them. Immigration becomes the primary demographic crutch, yet cultural friction, economic competition for remaining jobs, and native resentment limit absorption capacity, producing parallel societies, enclaves of unintegrated populations, and rising social tension rather than seamless replacement. The economic mathematics of contraction prove unforgiving once critical thresholds pass. When working age populations shrink by 10 to 15% within a single generation, tax bases contract faster than expenditures, forcing either austerity that erodes living standards or debt accumulation that eventually triggers sovereign crises. Interest rates rise to attract capital, inflating servicing costs until default restructuring or inflationary wipeout becomes inevitable. Currency debasement accelerates as central banks monetize deficits, punishing savers and rewarding early debtors while eroding purchasing power for fixed income retirees and wage earners alike. Asset bubbles form in remaining high demand sectors. Luxury real estate, technology equities, precious metals then burst when liquidity dries up and forced selling cascades. Unemployment concentrates among remaining young workers as businesses downsize, automate, or relocate to more favorable jurisdictions. Consumption collapses in discretionary categories: travel, dining, entertainment, fashion, beauty, while essentials, food, energy, healthcare command ever larger budget shares, producing widespread material hardship even among middle class households. Urban centers hollow out first as childless professionals and retirees predominate, leaving vast swaths of family oriented housing vacant or converted to short term rentals, student dormitories, or institutional use. Retail districts, once bustling with strollers, toy stores, children's clothing boutiques, and family restaurants, give way to medical supply stores, mobility aid shops, funeral services, and elder daycares. Public schools consolidate into fewer, larger facilities, then close entirely as enrollment falls below viability thresholds, forcing long bus rides for remaining students and community resistance to lost neighborhood anchors. Parks, playgrounds, libraries, and recreational centers face budget cuts, reduced hours, or outright closure, shifting public space toward elderly fitness classes, quiet reading areas, and dog walking zones rather than active family play. Transportation networks scale back routes, frequency, and coverage as ridership drops, while road maintenance lags, producing pothole ridden streets, crumbling bridges, and delayed transit upgrades. The physical fabric of cities reflects demographic reality: aging infrastructure serving aging populations with diminishing resources allocated to preservation rather than renewal. Rural areas face even steeper decline as young adults concentrate in remaining urban job markets, leaving behind ghost towns, depopulated counties, and abandoned farmland. Agricultural productivity holds through mechanization, yet food security becomes vulnerable when supply chains lengthen, labor shortages hit harvest seasons, and climate pressures compound mechanical failures. Small town hospitals, emergency services, police and fire departments consolidate or close, forcing longer response times and reduced capacity during crises. Community institutions, churches, schools, general stores, post offices lose viability when critical mass disappears, turning once cohesive settlements into clusters of isolated elderly residents dependent on distant deliveries, sporadic home health aides, and infrequent family visits. The cultural memory embedded in place, names, local traditions, oral histories, and physical landmarks fades as fewer people inherit or transmit it, producing regions defined more by absence than presence. Technological adaptation offers partial mitigation, yet cannot fully substitute for human scale. Automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, and advanced manufacturing maintain output per worker in high productivity sectors, allowing smaller populations to sustain material living standards longer than raw numbers suggest. Yet innovation itself slows when talent pools shrink, risk tolerance declines, and funding prioritizes incremental improvements over moonshot projects. Breakthroughs in longevity, cancer treatment, neurodegenerative disease, and regenerative medicine extend healthy lifespans primarily for older cohorts, widening the dependency ratio further as productive years fail to keep pace with chronological ones. Energy transitions proceed unevenly with nuclear fusion, small modular reactors, advanced geothermal, and next generation solar, potentially providing abundant clean power, yet deployment lags behind demographic contraction, leaving legacy grids strained and vulnerable to blackouts during peak demand or extreme weather. Social cohesion frays under these strains as zero sum competition intensifies for remaining resources jobs, housing, medical slots, pension payouts, political representation. Generational conflict sharpens between retirees demanding entitlement preservation and younger cohorts refusing to pay into insolvent systems. Ethnic, cultural, and class divisions deepen when immigration serves as primary population stabilizer, producing enclaves that maintain higher fertility and internal solidarity, while native born populations shrink and atomize. Political systems polarize toward authoritarian populism, promising order, security, and restoration versus technocratic managerialism focused on efficiency, automation, surveillance, and managed decline. Extremes gain traction when moderate voices fail to deliver tangible improvements, leaving electorates vulnerable to charismatic figures who exploit grievance without offering viable paths forward. Men who anticipated this trajectory decades earlier now occupy positions of relative advantage, having built portable wealth, diversified assets, international networks, and psychological resilience that allow navigation of turbulence with minimal disruption. They maintain low profiles, avoid entanglement in domestic politics, and position themselves as beneficiaries rather than victims of contraction, choosing jurisdictions that offer stability, rule of law, low extraction, and cultural compatibility. Some form intentional communities, digital or physical, where shared values, self sufficiency, mutual aid, and selective reproduction create pockets of flourishing amid broader decay. Others continue solitary optimization, refining systems, mastering new domains, and documenting journeys for future generations who may inherit even more constrained circumstances. The final picture that emerges carries both tragedy and inevitability. Societies that once commanded global dominance through demographic vitality, institutional strength, and cultural confidence now confront the consequences of incentives that systematically discouraged the behaviors necessary for their own perpetuation. The men who walked away did not set out to bankrupt nations or engineer extinction. They simply responded to conditions as presented, calculating that personal peace, autonomy, and security outweighed the uncertain returns of traditional participation. Their collective choice aggregated into structural transformation that no single policy, no cultural campaign, and no technological fix appears capable of fully reversing once momentum solidifies. Yet history demonstrates that civilizations adapt, rise anew, or fade into memory, often in ways unforeseen by contemporaries. The current path need not represent terminal decline if enough actors recognize the feedback loop between individual defection and collective collapse and act decisively to realign incentives, protect legitimate interests, and rebuild mutual trust. Absent such recognition, the default becomes gradual contraction, punctuated by crises until new equilibria emerge around smaller populations, different governance models, altered cultural priorities, and redefined notions of progress, success, and meaning. And in the end, the story resolves not in apocalypse, but in consequence. Men walked away, found peace in solitude, and in doing so, forced societies to confront the true cost of messages that declared them optional, disposable, or toxic. The ledger now balances with shrinking tax bases, collapsing birth rates, hollowed institutions, and fading vitality. Whether this ledger closes permanently or opens onto renewed balance depends on whether the remaining participants prove willing to rewrite the terms of engagement before the page turns for the last time. That wraps up the deep dive into what happens when men walk away and the systems built around their participation start to crumble. If you made it this far, you belong to the 1 hour gang. Respect for sticking through every layer of this analysis. If these angry guy breakdowns hit home and you want more content that cuts straight to the core without sugarcoating, feel free to show support by grabbing me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It keeps the engine running for the next one. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you see this playing out in real time? Do you agree with the patterns, or do you think there's a different angle that changes the outcome? Share what hits you hardest, or where you see pushback coming from. Like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video, and just remember that all roads lead to MWA men walking away in cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.